Some stories wait a lifetime to be told. In an attic filled with dust and silence, an old woman finds a letter meant only for the day she's ready to forgive herself. What she reads takes us back to a war, to a nameless soldier, to a promise never fulfilled. Until now. If this is your first time here, welcome to a place where forgotten voices are heard and every story has a soul. Make sure to subscribe, because some of the most powerful stories are the ones that almost went untold. It was one of those early winter nights when the wind didn't howl, it whispered. The kind of night where even the shadows seem to pause and listen. In a quiet suburb just outside Macon, Georgia, the porch lights flickered, and the houses sat like sleeping giants wrapped in woolen fog. Inside one of them, at the end of a winding road where the mailbox leaned slightly to one side, lived an 87-year-old woman named Helen McAdams. Helen didn't talk much these days. Her words had become fewer with time, like the leaves on the tree outside her kitchen window. But her mind, still sharp, still full. There were names she hadn't spoken in decades, places she'd visited only in dreams, faces she remembered more vividly than the ones she saw in the mirror. That night, Helen moved slower than usual. Her knees worn from years of service, both on the battlefield and in the quiet corners of her home, ached with every step. But something had shifted in her. Maybe it was the way the moonlight streamed through the lace curtains, like it was pointing somewhere. Or maybe it was that strange dream the night before, the one where she stood at the edge of a cliff and someone behind her whispered, "It's time." With a soft grunt, she reached for her cane, its wooden grip smooth and familiar, and made her way toward the attic door. The old pull-down ladder groaned in protest, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Dust floated like old ghosts in the beam of her flashlight as she climbed each step, careful, deliberate. The attic smelled like forgotten summer's wood, mildew, maybe even a hint of lavender from an old sachet buried under boxes. Her flashlight flicked across piles of yellowing newspaper, worn suitcases, and Christmas decorations that hadn't seen the light in over a decade. And then she saw a dot in the far corner, tucked beneath a moth-eaten quilt and half covered by a stack of magazines from the 1960s, was an old wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, but heavier, sturdier. Its surface was scarred with scratches and dents, like it had survived not just time, but life. A silver rope, faded and fraying, was wrapped around it in a crude knot. She recognized that knot. She'd tied it herself. Helen lowered herself to the dusty floor, her breath shallow, heart tapping softly like a drum echoing through memory. With trembling fingers, she reached for the box and pulled it close. The rope gave a little resistance, like it wasn't quite ready to let go, but then it loosened, fell away. She sat still for a moment, the box resting in her lap, her palms flat on the lid. Her hands, now marked by time, spotted, veined, curled, ever so slightly by arthritis, had once been strong enough to carry wounded soldiers through the mud. Hands that had held pressure on open wounds, written final messages, comforted dying boys. These hands had done more than most knew. But tonight, they were afraid. On the lid, barely visible in the low light, was a line carved in small, uneven letters, not with a knife or a pen, scratched in like someone had done it in a hurry, or through tears. Only open when you're brave enough to forgive yourself. Helen blinked back, a sting in her eyes. She hadn't opened this box in almost 70 years. She had sealed it on a rainy night in 1955, her red curls still damp from the storm, her uniform hanging in the hallway closet for the last time. That night, she'd sat on the floor of a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Savannah, shaking, crying, putting piece after piece of her past inside that box. As if maybe, just maybe, if she locked them away, the memories would stop chasing her, but they never did. With a soft exhale, She lifted the lid. Inside, time had not moved. Everything lay just as she left it. A pair of dog tags with the chain broken. A faded photograph of young soldiers sitting on sandbags, their faces smudged with dirt and laughter. Her nurse's badge dented at the corner, but still shining in places. A silk handkerchief embroidered with the initials DM. And then, the letter. It was folded neatly. The paper yellowed at the edges, but still whole. Her name, Helen, was written across it in her own handwriting, along with that haunting sentence once more. Only open when you're ready to forgive yourself. She stared at the letter like it might disappear. The attic seemed to close in around her, quiet except for the creaking of the beams and the wind whispering through the eaves. Her fingers shook as she picked it up, her thumb brushing the corner. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she held it to her chest, eyes closed. Memories came rushing in like floodwaters. The tent hospital. The smell of antiseptic and blood. Rain pouring outside while someone screamed inside. The young man with no face, only eyes blue, pleading, terrified. The way his hand reached for hers in the final seconds. The way she told him she would stay. That he wasn't alone. That he mattered. But when he died, she hadn't remembered his name. Not for sure. She had guesses. But no one could confirm anything. He had no ID, no voice left, no one to claim him. The military buried him as an unknown dot, and Helen carried that with her for a lifetime. She had saved dozens of lives. Hundreds, maybe. She had trained younger nurses. Treated officers and privates alike. She had held her head high when she came. Home at least on the outside. But on the inside? There was always that one. The one she couldn't save. The one who died with her name on his lips, or so she liked to believe. She unfolded the letter. It wasn't long. Just a single page, written in a younger version of her own cursive. The words swam before her eyes, not because they were hard to read, but because she had carried them inside her for so long without letting them speak. Helen, if you're reading this, and maybe you finally stopped running. Maybe you finally looked in the mirror and seen someone worth forgiving. You stayed. You held his hand. You didn't turn away. That matters. It mattered to him, and it should matter to you. She covered her mouth, a sob escaping before she could stop it. Her shoulders shook. You weren't God. You weren't a miracle. You were a 19-year-old girl doing her best in a world torn to pieces. You gave him comfort. You gave him dignity. And maybe that's all anyone could have asked of you. Helen wiped her eyes with her sleeve, the tears leaving tracks in the dust. On her face. It's time to forgive yourself. You are not what you lost. You are what you gave. She sat there a long while, holding that letter like a relic, as the cold crept into her bones, and the past finally began to settle. Downstairs. The furnace kicked on with a gentle rumble, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. The world hadn't changed, but she had. Helen placed the letter gently back into the box. She didn't tie the rope this time. She left it open, like a window cracked just enough to let spring air in after a long winter. And as she descended the attic ladder, one step at a time, she didn't feel lighter, but she felt real in a way she hadn't in 70 years. The air in Westboro, Georgia, always seemed thick with the scent of magnolias and expectation. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and everyone expected the same thing out of a girl like Helen McAdams. She was 19 years old then, with fiery red curls that couldn't be tamed, and a sharp tongue that got her into trouble more often than not. But her smile? That could soften even the most hardened soul in church on Sunday morning. She was beautiful in the way small-town girls sometimes are sun-kissed skin from helping in the garden, hands calloused from chores, and eyes that held dreams far bigger than the main street. They stared down every day. People had plans for Helen. That McAdams girl, they'd say, she'd make a fine wife. Probably marry Bobby Ray from the hardware store, have 4 kids, and teach Sunday school. And for a while, even Helen thought that might be her path. Until the war took her brother. Danny McAdams was 2 years older than Helen, and everything. She wasn't quiet, steady, kind in a way that made people trust him instantly. He could fix anything with his hands and listen without interrupting. He was her anchor, her compass. When he enlisted and went off to fight in Korea, Helen wrote him letters every Sunday without fail. She'd sit on the porch with sweet tea in one hand and a pen in the other, pouring her world into paper. Town gossip, their mother's peach cobbler, the way the cat had kittens again. And then, one morning in February, a telegram arrived that it came in an envelope with a government seal and cold, formal words. "We regret to inform you." That's all Helen remembered. Her mama collapsed right there in the kitchen. Her daddy didn't speak for 2 days. And Helen? She walked barefoot into the woods behind their house, knelt at the old creek bed, and screamed until her voice broke. That was the day something cracked inside her. For weeks, she went through the motions. She helped with chores. She made dinner. She folded laundry. But everything felt hollow, like she was sleepwalking through someone else's life. The town offered sympathy, pity, wrapped in casseroles and gentle hands on her shoulder, but no one really understood. They saw Danny's death as a sacrifice, a tragedy, but not a reason to change anything. But Helen couldn't stay the same. Couldn't pretend like her brother's life and death was just another line in the town paper. One Sunday after church, she overheard 2 women whispering behind her in the pews. Such a shame. A fine boy like Danny, gone so young. Yes. Thank God Helen still has her future. She's got good hips, she bears strong boys. Helen didn't turn around. She just stood up, walked out of the church barefoot, and didn't stop walking until she reached the edge of town. That night, she sat at Danny's desk, running her fingers over the dented wood, the initials he had carved in one summer when they were just kids. Her eyes landed on the recruitment pamphlet he had once left behind. Be the difference. Be a medic. Save lives. She read it 3 times before sunrise. By Monday morning, Helen had made up her mind. Her mama cried when she told her. Her daddy didn't say a word, just looked at her with eyes that had already lost too much. A town, predictably, whispered. A girl joining the military? Voluntarily? It wasn't unheard of, but it was rare. Especially for a girl who had once won the county fair pie contest and was expected to settle down before her 21st birthday. But Helen didn't care. She didn't want to be a wife. She didn't want to teach Sunday school. She didn't want to smile through her brother's funeral and then pretend like the world hadn't changed. She wanted to do something, so she applied to become an army nurse. The process wasn't easy. She was young, unmarried, fresh out of high school with only a few months of basic medical training at the local community college. But she was stubborn. She studied harder than anyone. She practiced bandaging wounds until her fingers ached. She memorized medical charts by candlelight when the electricity went out. And then she got her orders. Helen would be sent to a mobile field hospital stationed just outside Seoul, South Korea. It was late in the war, but the region was still unstable. She didn't care. She wanted to be there, where it hurt, where it mattered. The night before she left, Helen sat on her childhood bed and stared out the window. Rain pelted the glass, soft and steady. Her mama stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes red. "You don't have to do this," she whispered. "Yes, Mama," Helen said, turning to face her. "I do." "You're not Danny." "No. I'm the one he left behind. And I can't just sit here and wait for the world to go quiet again." They didn't hug. They didn't cry together. It wasn't how things were done back then. But before her mama turned away, she left something on Helen's bed. A small blue handkerchief embroidered with daisies. "So you don't forget where you come from," she said softly. Helen tucked it into her duffel bag. The next morning, she boarded a military bus that would take her to basic training. The air was cold, her breath visible as she waved goodbye to no one. As the bus rumbled past the edge of town, she watched the water tower disappear from view. That was the last time she saw Westboro for almost 4 years. What came next wasn't glory. It wasn't medals or stirring speeches. It was blood, mud, screams in the dark. Nights spent kneeling in broken tents, sewing stitches by lantern light, praying the boy on the cot in front of her would make it through the hour. She was 19 when she saw her first man die. He was just a kid. Couldn't have been more than 17. Shot in the chest during a supply run. He cried for his mother. Helen held his hand and told him she was coming. He looked right at her and said, "I'm scared," and then he was gone. She went to the back of the tent and threw up in a bucket, and then she went back to work. There wasn't time to fall apart. Not there. Not in that place. War aged her. Fast, but it also sharpened something inside her. By the time she turned 20, Helen could set a broken bone, insert N4, and wrap a head wound blindfolded. She learned to tell if someone was going to make it by the look in their eyes. And she never forgot a face, never forgot the names of the boys she couldn't save. She wrote every one of them down in a little notebook she kept tucked into her uniform jacket. She didn't do it for medals. She did it because it felt like maybe, in some way, she was making up for Danny. Maybe if she saved enough lives, the world would balance out. But deep down, she knew it never worked like that. Still, she kept going, until the day the nameless soldier came in. But that is a story for another page. There were days in the field hospital when everything moved so fast that Helen forgot what silence sounded like. The clatter of metal trays, the cries of pain, the rhythmic orders shouted across tents. It all blended into a kind of organized chaos, a symphony of survival. She had grown used to the rhythm of it. Not comfortable, but practiced. But that morning was different. The sky was a sheet of gray, hanging low like it was weighed down by grief. Outside, the rain came down in sheets, soaking the muddy ground around the hospital tents. Water pooled beneath the cots and dripped through the makeshift canvas roofs. The scent of iodine, gunpowder, and wet earth hung thick in the air. Elan had just finished wrapping the shattered leg of a private when a young corporal ran in, soaked to the bone and breathless. "Incoming," he gasped. "Critical. No ID. Facial trauma." The words hit her like cold water. "How bad?" she asked. The corporal didn't answer, just turned and held the flap open as 2 medics came in, dragging a stretcher between them. On it lay a soldier, bloody, limp, and barely breathing. Helen rushed over. At first glance, she couldn't even tell how old he was. His face, it was torn by shrapnel. The left side swollen and torn, bruised purple and black. His helmet had been ripped off, his uniform shredded. One dog tag was missing. The other, twisted, unreadable, hung from his neck like a useless key. But it was his eyes that stopped her. He looked up at her, barely conscious, but locked in. Blue eyes, sharp and wide, filled with something she couldn't explain. Not just fear, not just pain, something else. Something desperate. Pleading. They set him down gently on the cot. Helen snapped into motion. "Vitals," she ordered. "Get me morphine, warm saline, gauze now." The other nurses scrambled. Helen pulled on her gloves, inspecting the damage. The wounds were deep, one gash across his jaw, another under his eye. His breathing was labored. He had lost a lot of blood, and his chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular motions. But those eyes never left hers. "Hey," she said gently, leaning in close. "You're all right. You're here now. We've got you." His lips moved slightly, like he was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Just a gurgle, followed by a cough that sprayed blood onto his chin. Helen wiped it quickly. "Don't try to talk. Save your strength." But he kept trying. His mouth formed the same shapes again and again. She leaned closer. "Danny," he mouthed. "Danny." And then, "Mom." Helen's chest tightened. Danny. That name. Her brother's name. Or maybe his own. Or someone he loved. She didn't know. But it stopped her cold. Her hands trembled just for a second before she steadied herself. "I'll be here," she whispered. "I'll stay. I promise." She reached out and held his hand, muddy, shaking, cold as the rain. For the next hour, Helen worked like a machine. She cleaned the wounds, stopped the bleeding, stitched the torn flesh with practiced precision. She wrapped his chest and started an IV, adjusting the flow with care. Other nurses came and went, but she stayed with him. The soldier never screamed, never made a sound, just kept staring at her, blinking slowly, like each moment might be his last, and he wanted to spend it memorizing her face. Somewhere in the back of the tent, another man cried out. A captain was losing consciousness. Someone else had gone into shock, but Helen didn't leave. She couldn't. Something about him anchored her. "We're gonna get through this," she said softly. "I'll write your mama. Tell her you were brave. You'll see her again. Just hold on." She didn't know if he heard her. His eyelids had started to flutter. His pulse weakened. The light behind those blue eyes began to fade. Then, for one fleeting second, he squeezed her hand. And then he was gone. No final words. No name. No story. Just silence. Helen stood there frozen, her hands still holding his. Around her, the world continued to spin. The rain beat down harder on the canvas above. Somewhere a radio crackled with orders. Another stretcher rolled in, but she didn't move, because something had happened in that moment. She had seen so many die already. Too many. And yet this one felt different. He had been alone in his last moments, except for her. No family, no name, no letters. Just a nurse he'd never met before, and a promise she whispered into the chaos. When she finally let go, her gloves were soaked in blood. She peeled them off, her fingers pale and trembling. She didn't cry. There was no time for that. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the blue handkerchief her mama had given her. Carefully, reverently, she used it to wipe the dried blood from the young man's cheek. Then, after folding it and tucking it into his shirt pocket, she reached for the torn remains of his uniform. Inside, she found a small folded piece of paper. A letter, still sealed. Still clean. She opened it slowly. It was written in neat cursive, shaky, but full of love. Addressed to Mama. It wasn't long. Just a few lines about missing home, praying for safety, hoping to see her soon. At the bottom, if I don't, come back. Tell her I tried my best. Tell her I wasn't afraid. Helen's throat burned. Her hands shook. She didn't know his name, but she knew his heart. She placed the letter back in his jacket pocket, pressed it flat, and buttoned the flap. Then she stood back and looked at him, really looked at him. He was someone's son, someone's boy. And now no one might ever know what became of him, but she would know. She would carry it. That night, Helen didn't sleep. She sat on a wooden crate behind the mess tent, staring into the rain. Her hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee gone cold. She replayed the day over and over in her head, trying to remember every detail: his eyes, the way he mouthed Danny, the slight twitch of his fingers when she held his hand. She thought about her brother, about the letter she had never found from him, about the quiet place in her soul that never fully healed Dot, and now there was a new wound. A deeper one. I didn't even know his name, she whispered into the dark. The next morning, she took out her notebook, the one where she wrote the names of the soldiers she couldn't save. This time, she paused. She didn't have a name. So she wrote something else instead. Blue eyes, no ID, spoke of Danny and Mama, died holding my hand. She closed the notebook and didn't open it again for a very long time. When Helen returned home, the war didn't stay behind. She stepped off the train onto the platform in Savannah in the spring of 1955, surrounded by families holding banners, balloons, and flowers. Soldiers were being embraced, kissed, lifted, off their feet in joyful reunions. But no one waited for her. No welcome home sign, no cameras, no warm hug. Just the Georgia sun on her back and the sound of her own footsteps echoing down the wooden platform as she carried a small suitcase in one hand and her nursing satchel in the other. The town was quieter than she remembered. Or maybe she was. Maybe everything just sounded distant now, like the world was playing in slow motion, and she couldn't catch up that her parents were both gone by. Then her father passed of a heart attack, shortly after Danny died, and her mother followed soon after, as if heartbreak could rot a person from the inside out. The house had been sold. The neighbors had moved on. So Helen rented a tiny one-bedroom above a bakery in downtown Savannah. The walls were thin, the floors creaked, and the place always smelled faintly of cinnamon and yeast. At night, she'd hear the bakers start work. At 3 a.m., the soft thumps of dough being kneaded in the darkness. She didn't mind the noise. It was the silence she feared, because when it got too quiet, the memories returned. They came in flashes, blood, screams, the weight of bodies in her arms, the sound of boots sloshing through mud, and always those eyes, blue, dying, watching her. The nameless soldier lived in her mind like a ghost. He would appear in dreams, his lips still trying to say something she couldn't quite hear. Sometimes she woke up gasping for air, fingers clenched into fists, chest heaving like she'd just run for miles. Other nights, she would sit bolt upright in bed, the sound of artillery echoing in her ears. Even though the war had ended years ago, no one talked about trauma back then. No one called it PTSD, especially not for women, especially not for nurses. People assumed she came back stronger. Brave Helen, they said. She saw the world. She helped save lives. She should be proud. But pride was not what she felt. What she felt was guilt, not just for the ones she couldn't save, but for surviving it all. So she disappeared, in her own way. Not physically, but emotionally. She avoided reunions, declined invitations, dodged conversations. She'd smile politely at the grocery store and say, "I'm doing just fine," even when she hadn't slept in days. She never married, not because no one asked. There were kind men, decent men, but she always said no, because how do you let someone into your heart when it's already haunted? Instead, Helen threw herself into work. She became a civilian nurse at the local hospital. She took double shifts, trained younger nurses, stayed late just to clean her own instruments. Her colleagues admired her, called her the calm in the storm. But none of them knew the storm she carried inside. She kept a drawer in her apartment locked. Inside was the blue handkerchief, the soldier's blood still faintly visible despite her efforts to wash it, the notebook with her list of lost names, and a letter never sent written on the back of a prescription pad. To the family of Va. The boy with blue eyes, it began. He wasn't alone. I held his hand. He was brave. I tried. She never mailed it. Who would she send it to? He had no name. No records matched his injuries. His dog tags were mangled. The military labeled him unidentified KIA. Buried in a grave marked only by a number and a small American flag. But Helen remembered him. Every November, without fail, she wrote him another letter. She'd sit by her window, pour herself a cup of black coffee, and pull out a fresh sheet of paper. "Dear soldier," she'd begin. "Another year gone, and I still see your eyes. I still wonder if you were scared, if I did enough. I hope, wherever you are, you know someone remembers." She kept them all, folded neatly, tied with a faded ribbon, stacked in a shoebox. Under her bed, over the years, her hands grew stiffer. Her eyesight dimmed. Her once red hair turned the color of ash. But the weight on her chest remained the same. She was honored once by the hospital for her years of service. They invited her to speak at a ceremony, to share her story. She declined. It wasn't heroism, she told the director. It was just being there when no one else could. He looked confused, but let it go. Helen didn't want medals. She didn't want applause. She just wanted to forget. But forgetting is tricky. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in pieces. You forget the color of a scarf, the sound of a laugh, the smell of a summer breeze on a foreign hill. But not everything fades. Some memories cling like thorns. By the time she turned 70, Helen had outlived almost everyone she'd ever known. Her coworkers had retired or passed on. Her neighbors changed. Children on the block grew up, moved out, and never looked back. She spent her days tending to a small garden, feeding stray cats, and reading the paper with shaking hands. Still, every November, she wrote the letter. One year, the pen slipped from her grasp. Her fingers cramped so badly she cried. But she kept going, even if the words looked more like scribbles than script. "I'm still here," she wrote, "and I still remember." She watched the world change around her. The wars were different. The uniforms new. But the losses were always the same. She kept a photo tucked in her Bible of a group of young soldiers smiling outside the hospital tent. Most were long gone. Some were never identified. But their faces reminded her of that year when she was 19, standing in the mud, holding on to hope with hands already too tired. One November, on the exact day she always wrote, a neighbor stopped by with a pie. "You always keep to yourself this time of year," the woman said. "Everything okay?" Helen smiled. "Just visiting old ghosts," she replied. The neighbor didn't ask questions. And so the silence continued. Not because no one cared, but because no one knew how to ask. Because Helen never let them. 70 years passed, and with every year, Helen became quieter, smaller, more brittle. But inside, that part of her never aged. The part that still saw blue eyes and a rain-soaked tent. The part that still whispered, "I'll stay with you," even in her sleep. It was a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind Helen had grown used to. The air was cold and crisp, the kind of cold that made your bones ache before your skin even noticed. Outside her window, the last leaves of fall blew across her front porch, dancing in little spirals before settling against the steps. She sat at her kitchen table with a chipped porcelain mug of tea in her hands, the kind of mug you keep, not because it's pretty, but because it's familiar. The radio played softly in the background, a station that only played old hymns and gospel songs. Helen liked that. The voices were steady, predictable. Nothing in them ever shouted. She had just taken her morning pills and reached for her crossword puzzle when it happened. Knock, knock, knock. 3 sharp raps at the front door. Helen froze. No one knocked anymore. Most folks who came by were delivery people who dropped packages and left. the neighbors texted or called first. And besides, she hadn't had a visitor in longer than she could remember. She waited a moment, half expecting it to be some kid selling magazines, or maybe someone lost. But then knock, knocked out again, steady, intentional. She sighed, stood slowly, and reached for her cane dot. The walk to the door was short but difficult. Her knees didn't move like they used to, and the cold always made her joints stiff. When she finally reached the doorknob, she took a breath and opened it. Standing on her porch was a young man. Mid-30s, maybe? Tall, with broad shoulders and a nervous look in his eyes. He wore a black peacoat and carried a manila envelope tucked under one arm. His hair was dark, a little unkempt, and his cheeks were red from the wind. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he cleared his throat. "Excuse me, are you Helen McAdams?" Helen narrowed her eyes, her hand tightening slightly on the edge of the door. "Who's asking?" "My name's Jack. Jack Daniels," he said with a sheepish smile. "And before you say anything, I've heard all the jokes. Believe me." Helen didn't smile. "What do you want, Mr. Daniels?" He hesitated, shifting on his feet. "I'm sorry to come by unannounced. I didn't know if you still lived here. I had to ask around. I didn't want to call because I thought maybe it'd be better to talk face to face." That made Helen's eyes narrow even further. "Talk about what?" Jack glanced down, then held out the manila envelope like it weighed more than it should have. I think you knew my grandfather." Helen blinked. "I'm not sure He served in Korea. He died there. I never met him, but I've been doing some digging. My mom gave me some of his things a few years ago. Letters, pictures. She never talked about him much, said it was too painful. But recently, I started going through everything." Helen opened the screen door a bit wider, the cold air rushing in. And Jack opened the envelope and gently pulled out a photograph fold. Black and white, edges yellowed with time. It showed a group of young soldiers and nurses standing outside a field hospital. Some were smiling. Some looked exhausted. Helen's heart stuttered, because there she was .19, in uniform. Red curls pinned back, holding a clipboard, and next to her, "This picture," Jack said quietly, "was the only one we had of my grandfather in uniform. But when I showed it to a military historian, he told me something strange. At most, of the people in this photo weren't supposed to be stationed together. He said there was a nurse in this picture who had been transferred to a different camp weeks before the photo was supposedly taken. But my grandfather, he died at that hospital." Helen's throat tightened. Jack held up the photo. "That nurse was you." She looked at the image again, her younger self staring back. Stronger, braver, a girl who still believed she could make things right. "He had no name," she whispered before she could stop herself. Jack looked up. "What?" Helen opened the door wider. "Come in." He stepped inside, the warmth hitting him like a wave. She led him to the kitchen and motioned for him to sit. She moved slowly, carefully. Not just because of her joints, but because the memories were coming too fast at once. They were both seated. She folded her hands. "Your grandfather, I don't know what his name was. He came in during a storm. No tags. Face was damaged, but he had the bluest eyes I'd ever seen. He couldn't talk. Just kept mouthing the name Danny and Mom." Jack swallowed. Hard. Danny was his younger brother. He died in a car accident when they were kids, and he was always close to his mother. My mom said he wrote to her every week from the front. Helen nodded slowly, her eyes distant. He held on longer than anyone thought possible. I stayed with him, talked to him, tried to keep him calm. He couldn't say anything back. But he looked at me like he wanted me to know something, like he was asking me for something. Jack reached into the envelope again and pulled out something else. A letter, worn, creased, but whole. This, he said softly, was found in his jacket. Never mailed. It was addressed to his mom, my great-grandmother. Helen's breath caught in her throat. I remember it, she said. I found it after he died. I put it back in his coat. I didn't want him to be buried without it. Jack nodded, gently laying it on the table. You're the one who made sure it stayed with him. My family never knew the full story. We just thought he died somewhere alone. But now No, he wasn't, because of you. Helen couldn't speak. Her fingers moved slowly toward the letter, hovering just above it, but not touching. His name, Jack said gently, was Samuel Daniels. He was 21. Helen closed her eyes. For 70 years, he had been the nameless soldier, the one memory that haunted her most. And now he had a name. Your grandfather, she whispered, was braver than anyone should ever have to be. They sat in silence for a moment. The clock ticked. The radio continued to hum in the background. Then Jack spoke again. My great-grandmother. She's still alive, 92. She lives in Kansas. Would you want to talk to her? Helen hesitated. And then, for the first time in decades, she nodded. The phone sat on the small wooden table near Helen's favorite chair, next to a dusty lamp and an old ceramic dish filled with peppermints no one had touched in years. For almost an hour after Jack left, Helen stared at it. Her hands hovered, then retreated. Her mind raced. What do you say to a mother after 70 years? What do you say when you've held her son's hand as he died, and then kept it to yourself for the rest of your life? What if she didn't want to talk? What if her voice cracked? From grief? What if it didn't crack at all? But the letter, the one Samuel had written all those years ago, was now sitting in Helen's lap. Jack had left it with her. He said his great-grandmother might want her to read it aloud, might want to hear it from the woman who was there. Helen had promised herself for years that if the day ever came, she'd be ready. She wasn't, but she picked up the phone anyway. Her fingers, stiff and swollen, dialed the number Jack had written on a small note card. It was long-distance Kansas, but she didn't care. She pressed the receiver to her ear and held her breath as the ringing started. Ring. 2. 3. 4. Click. A woman's voice answered. Hello? It was quiet, soft, dry, like the wind rolling through a wheat field. The kind of voice that had known age, loss, and prayer equal measure. Helen's mouth was dry. She cleared her throat. Mrs. Daniels? Yes. My name is Helen McAdams. She stopped. Her throat tightened. The silence stretched. I'm sorry to call out of the blue, but I think you might know the name. I was a nurse in Korea a long time ago. The phone line went quiet, not dead, not dropped, just still. Then came a sound, a breath, a soft intake, like someone realizing something old and buried had just stirred. You were there, the woman finally said. With my son. Helen closed her eyes. Yes, I was with Samuel when he passed. Another pause. This one longer. I always wondered, Mrs. Daniels said, if he died alone. If anyone stayed. Helen took a shaky breath, her eyes already wet. I stayed, she whispered. I held his hand the whole time. What followed wasn't crying. It wasn't wailing. It was something deeper. A sigh that sounded like it came from the soul. Like air being released from a balloon held for 70 years. Thank you, Mrs. Daniels said. I didn't know. No one ever told us. I wanted to. I wrote letters, but I didn't know where to send them. I didn't even know his name back then. He couldn't speak. His face was wounded. His tags were gone. They told us there was no record, she said, voice tight but calm. Just that he died in combat and was buried somewhere in Korea. I kept writing letters to the army, asking for more information. For anything, I used to sit by the mailbox every day. Helen wiped her cheek with a tissue. He said your name. Or tried to. He kept mouthing it. Mom, and a name Danny. Jack told me Danny was his brother? Yes, she replied. Danny was just a boy when we lost him. Sammy never stopped missing him. He carried his photo in his coat. Helen nodded, though the woman couldn't see. That photo. It was in his breast pocket, along with your letter. I made sure they stayed with him. I didn't want him to go without something of home. There was a long pause. You were the last person to see my boy, Mrs. Daniels said quietly. Yes. Was he afraid? Helen swallowed hard. Her voice almost broke. Not when he looked at me. He couldn't talk, but he looked right into my eyes. And I think he knew he wasn't alone. A choked sob traveled through the phone line, and Helen waited, giving her space, not pushing. Just holding space for 70 years of pain. Do you still remember his face? Mrs. Daniels asked. After a while, Helen didn't hesitate. Every day. I was only 19, but I've never forgotten him. Not once. He had the kindest eyes I've ever seen. And something in them, something that still haunts me. Like he wanted to say more. Like he had unfinished words. I stayed. I whispered. To him, I told him he mattered. I hope he heard me. He did, the old woman whispered. I know he did. God wouldn't have let him leave this world without hearing kindness. There was silence again. This time softer. Calmer. Helen glanced down at the letter in her lap. Mrs. Daniels, she said gently, would you like me to read the letter? The one he wrote you? Yes, the woman said without hesitation. Please. Helen unfolded the fragile paper, careful not to tear it. Her voice shook as she began. Dear Mama, I don't know if this will reach you. They're moving us again soon, and there's been trouble near the river. But I wanted to write you something just in case. Not to worry you. Just to tell you some things I haven't said enough. Helen paused, her throat catching. Then she continued. If I don't come home, I want you to know that I tried my best. I want you to know I wasn't afraid, not really. I thought I might be, but being here, doing what we're doing, I think I understand now. I'm not a hero. I'm just one of many trying to do something good. Please don't cry for me. Remember me in the kitchen. Remember me fixing the barn door, laughing when I dropped the hammer on my toe. And tell Danny, if he's listening, I'm trying to make you proud for both of us. Helen had to stop. Her voice trembled. She pressed a tissue to her lips. It ends like this, she finally said. Mama, I love you. If someone's with me at the end, tell them thank you. Tell them I'm grateful for their kindness. I hope they know that. I hope they feel it. Your son, Sammy. The phone line went silent again. Then Helen heard it, just the faintest sound. Not words, just weeping. Raw. Real. Years worth. She didn't interrupt. She let the mother cry. When Mrs. Daniels finally spoke again, her voice was cracked but steady. Thank you, Helen, for everything. For being there. For reading that. For carrying him with you when no one else could. I didn't know how to let go, Helen whispered. I've lived with his memory for so long. I wrote him letters every year. I kept them all. He wouldn't want you to feel guilt. He'd want you to feel peace. Helen's lips trembled. That's what I've been waiting to hear. They sat together across the distance of miles and decades. Two old women who had shared one boy's final moment in different ways. One by blood, the other by fate. "I never thought I'd get this call," Mrs. Daniels said gently. "And I never thought I'd make it," Helen replied. They both laughed, soft, tired. Healing. As the call wound down, Mrs. Daniels said one last thing. "Helen? Yes, you were his angel." Helen closed her eyes. For 70 years, she had waited for someone to say she hadn't failed. Tonight, she finally believed it. Spring in Georgia comes slowly. First, it teases with warmer breezes, then with birdsong, and finally, like a sigh of relief after a long-held breath, the earth begins to bloom. By late March, Helen's backyard, once dry and silent, started to stir again, daffodils peeking through the soil, bees humming lazily, and robins hopping near the worn fence. Helen stood on her back porch with a wool cardigan draped over her shoulders, a small gardening spade in one hand and a folded note in the other. Her knees ached, but she didn't mind. The sun was soft on her face. For the first time in years, she felt like the air didn't weigh her down. She'd been expecting them. 2 days earlier, Jack had called. His great-grandmother Samuel's mother wanted to come. She didn't want a big ceremony. Just a moment. Just to meet Helen. And if Helen was willing, she wanted to plant something in Samuel's memory. Helen had paused, looking out the window at her backyard overgrown. A little wild, but familiar. "There's a spot under the oak tree," she'd said softly into the phone. "It gets the best light in the morning. He might like that." And so, that morning, Jack's car rolled up Helen's gravel driveway. It was an old sedan, nothing fancy, but clean and cared for. Helen watched from the porch as he gently opened the passenger door and helped Mrs. Evelyn Daniels step out. She was small, frail, but stood with surprising dignity for someone who had passed her 92nd birthday. She wore a lavender dress and a matching hat, her white gloves clutched tightly in one hand. Around her neck hung a simple gold locket. Helen somehow knew who was inside. Jack held Evelyn's arm as they made their way up the path. When they reached the porch, Evelyn looked up, and for a moment, she and Helen just stared at each other. Two women, strangers in every sense, but one. And Evelyn reached out. Helen took her hand. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Inside, Jack made tea and set out a small tray of butter cookies, which Evelyn politely nibbled on. They sat in Helen's living room, where time seemed frozen. The same floral couch from the 1960s. Framed photos of Helen's parents. A cross on the wall. Dusty, quiet, sacred. Evelyn looked around and smiled. "It's peaceful here." "It's been quiet," Helen replied. "But maybe I needed the silence." Jack broke the tension. "Would you ladies like to head out back? The ground's soft today. And I brought the flowers." They agreed. The garden had been cleaned up a bit in preparation. Helen, with Jack's help, had cleared the weeds and trimmed the hedges. In the corner, under the large oak tree, a small patch of fresh soil waited. A little stone plaque lay beside it, resting gently against the trunk. Evelyn shuffled closer and knelt slowly Jack by her side in case she lost her balance. "These were his favorite," she said, pulling a bundle of small blue hyacinths from the bag Jack had carried. Helen knelt beside her, her knees protesting the motion, but she didn't care. "They'll bloom beautifully here," she whispered. They dug side by side, two women from different times, different states, connected by a boy neither had seen in 70 years. When the last bulb was pressed into the earth, Evelyn sat back and looked toward the sky. "I used to imagine him under a tree like this," she said quietly. "Reading. He loved to read. History, mostly. I'd find him out in the field with a book on his chest, asleep in the sun." Helen smiled. "He wasn't afraid," she said again. "Not at the end. He looked at me like he'd made peace. He said your name, and his brothers. Evelyn closed her eyes and breathed in deep. The wind carried the smell of wet earth and early blossoms. Jack stepped forward with the small plaque and placed it at the base of the tree. It read, "In loving memory of Samuel Daniels, 1933 to 1954. Was never alone." Evelyn reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue. A photo, weathered, soft at the edges. She handed it to Helen. "This was the last picture I took of him before he shipped out," Evelyn said. "I want you to have it." Helen took the photo with trembling fingers. Samuel looked young, strong, a gentle smile on his face, a softness in his eyes that matched the look she remembered, the one he gave her. When she held his hand, tears welled in Helen's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. For a long time, they sat under the oak tree, the sun filtering through the branches above. No flags, no rifles, no trumpets. Just a garden, a mother, a nurse, and a grandson carrying the legacy of a man who had been forgotten by everyone but them. Evelyn began to hum softly, a tune Helen recognized. "It is well, it is well with my soul." Helen joined in, her voice fragile but steady, and together they sang. Just a verse, just enough. Afterward, Jack helped his great-grandmother to her feet. They turned to leave, but Evelyn paused. She reached into her locket, opened it, and gently removed a small clipping of hair. "I've kept this since he was a baby," she said. "Will you place it in the garden with him?" Helen nodded, tears falling freely now. She dug a tiny hole beside the flowers, placed the golden brown curl inside, and covered it gently with soil. "He's home now," Evelyn whispered. When they hugged goodbye, it wasn't stiff or awkward. It was long and real. Two souls holding each other up. "Thank you, Helen," Evelyn said, gripping her hand, "for being his last kindness." "And thank you," Helen said, "for letting me forgive myself." As Jack guided his great-grandmother to the car, Helen stood on the porch and watched them drive away. The wind rustled the leaves above the hyacinths, which seemed to glow in the late afternoon sun. For the first time in 70 years, Helen felt lighter. She went back inside, made herself a cup of tea, and sat by the window overlooking the garden. She watched the flowers sway gently in the breeze, and for the first time, she didn't think of war. She thought of peace. She thought of Samuel. She thought of the moment he let go, and the moment she finally did, too. And as the sun dipped low and the stars began to appear, Helen whispered one last thing into the fading light. "You're remembered. You always were." That night, after the garden had settled and the sky turned deep navy, Helen sat in her favorite chair by the window, the same place she'd written so many letters over the years. But this time, there was no pen trembling in her hand. Not yet. She simply sat in the quiet, watching the blue hyacinths sway beneath the old oak tree. The moon cast a soft glow across the blossoms, and for a moment, it looked almost silver, like Samuel's memory reaching back through time to sit beside her. The house was still. The heater hummed softly. The clock on the wall ticked in its steady rhythm. And outside, the wind gently rustled the leaves. Helen felt calm. Not the kind of calm that came from being tired. Not the kind that comes when something you've carried for too long finally sets itself down. For 70 years, she had walked through life with a weight on her chest. A silent question she never allowed herself to ask out loud. Was I enough? Now, for the first time, she knew the answer. And it wasn't written in any military file or carved into a gravestone. It was in a stranger's hug, in a mother's trembling voice, in the soft blue petals of a flower planted under the sun. Helen took a deep breath and stood. Her legs ached, but her steps were steady as she crossed the room to the old wooden desk against the wall. The drawer creaked open. Inside were her envelopes, her stationery, and a tin box full of saved stamps. But tonight, she reached for something else, got the small wooden box. The same one she had opened in the attic just days earlier. She carried it carefully to the table and sat back down. Slowly, gently, she opened the lid and looked inside. Everything was still there. The nurse's badge, the faded photograph of the field hospital, the mangled dog tag, the stack of letters she had written to Samuel every November, still bound with a blue ribbon, each envelope marked with the year. Helen reached for a fresh piece of paper and placed it in front of her. Not to Samuel, not to the army, not to the past. This one was for herself. Her hand shook only slightly as she picked up her pen. The ink flowed easily. Her cursive was slower now, but it still held the strength of the young woman who had once written letters by lantern light in a muddy war tent. She began, "Dear Helen, if you're reading this, it means you finally stopped trying to carry everything alone. That you finally realized you were never meant to. I know what you've been through. I know the nights you couldn't sleep, the faces you remembered, the guilt you felt, even when you had nothing to be guilty for. I know how you avoided looking at your own reflection for years, afraid you'd see failure instead of someone who showed up. You've spent a lifetime believing that because you couldn't save one boy, everything else didn't count. But that's not true. You were there. You stayed. When the world was falling apart, when death was close enough to breathe in, you stayed. You held his hand. You gave him comfort. You gave him dignity. You gave him a goodbye. And that matters more than you'll ever know. You were never a hero, and that's okay. You were something rarer. You were kind in the face of chaos. You were soft in the heart of war. You didn't speak much about your service. You let the world forget. But what you did that mattered. Even if no one clapped. Even if no one wrote articles or gave you medals. You mattered. You still do. You thought this burden would stay with you forever. But tonight, something changed. You heard a mother's voice. You saw her eyes. You touched the soil where flowers now bloom. And you realized you don't need to carry this anymore. You've already carried it long enough. You have nothing left to prove. And so, Helen, this is what I want you to remember. You didn't fail him. You honored him. And by doing so, you honored yourself. Rest now, not because you're tired, but because you're finally free. With love. Helen, when she finished, she placed the pen down gently and folded the letter. Her fingers brushed the edge slowly, reverently, like it was a sacred thing. She placed it inside the wooden box, along with the others, and closed the lid. No rope this time. No lock. Just quiet. Just peace. She turned off the light and made her way to the armchair near the fireplace. The same one Danny used to sit in as a boy, swinging his feet while reading comic books. Helen lowered herself into it with a soft sigh. The blue handkerchief was folded in her lap. She looked out the window one last time. The garden glowed silver under the moonlight. The flowers gently moved in the breeze, like they were whispering something back to her. She smiled, not because of something funny, not because of something someone said. She smiled because she knew. She had done enough. And that was everything. Her eyes fluttered closed, her breathing even and slow. Outside, the wind picked up ever so slightly, carrying the faint scent of earth and hyacinth through the cracks in the window. And for the first time in 70 years, Helen slept without dreams. In the quiet of the night, she finally forgave herself. Not because someone told her to, but because she had been enough, just by being there when no one else could. A lifetime of silence, healed by a single truth. You don't have to be a hero to matter. You just have to care. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a little light tonight. Here, every memory matters. and every voice still echoes